From Cuban soldiers fighting in Mozambique to little green men, as we say, Zoloni Chilovetsky in Ukraine, there is a surge in proxy wars. From Yemen to Syria and from Libya to Mali, we have vicious and costly inhuman life wars that do not legally involve the states. Even worse now, with the rapid expansion of the internet, we see more issues taking place, from the monopoly of press in the former Eastern Bloc to the wild west of social media platforms. We are moving from absolutist or hierarchical to totalitarian models of information control. We have evolved from a ministry of propaganda, if I may say, to influence operations that never happened, from televised McCarthy-era testimonies and Stalinist show trials to the mass media and mass data mining from phone companies and social media platforms that, again, never happened. Professor Singleton, during the Cold War, we saw the proliferation of proxy warfare through the supply of arsenal and military advisors. Do you feel history is likely to repeat itself?
Thank you, Karina. First, by the way, I can't resist a one-liner on the subject of being on the right side of history. To be on the right side of history, two things have to be the case. First, you have to have a moral cause that other people will recognize as good. And there's not just one of those, there's a bunch of them. Second, you have to win, because the winners do indeed write the history. And sometimes those two things get in each other's way, which I think is what Professor Hillis was talking about, and I would agree entirely. Okay, proxy wars. What's new? First point, the idea of proxies has always been with us. It has never stopped. It just means a foreign country or force abets and arms someone in another country for its own interest and purposes. The ancient Greeks were very good at this. They mobilized political parties and mobs and coups in rival cities. Spain mobilized Catholics in England against Queen Elizabeth. The Soviets used communist parties in every country, some of which were quite violent. And China in Mao's time sent weapons to all sorts of liberation movements, including some like UNITA in Angola, also supported by the United States. 2 points about proxies. Proxy implies dependence. Dependence is a matter of degree. Most proxy relationships are really more like alliances. One of my favorite Cold War cases were the Cubans and the Soviets. Over time, Castro became fully dependent on the Soviet aid, but he also made a lot of decisions and took risks on his own. For example, most famously sending Cuban troops to Angola in 1975 before he had Soviet agreement to do so. Soviets got on board. Now, does this make Cuba a Soviet proxy? Is Hezbollah an Iranian proxy? Well, they are dependent on Iranian money and weapons, but they're a strong organization with a capable leader, which is at once an army, a political party, and part of the Lebanese government. It shares ideology with the mullahs in Tehran and Qom, but I'm not sure it will simply follow what it is told to do. It will have to be consulted. These proxy relationships can be ideological. The Cuban-Russian one, Hezbollah and Iran, or they can be more purely transactional. I spent a lot of time in the 70s into the 90s studying Soviet relations with the Southern African liberation movements. That was pretty transactional. Same thing is true of United States aid to the anti-Soviet Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The other point is that proxies are not just armed groups, and certainly not just groups labeled terrorists. You can have political parties, religious organizations, governments. Russia considers international NGOs as Western proxies. Now, the Cold War pattern you mentioned, has anything changed? Well, the Cold War pattern was not what most people think. Most people think the United States and the Soviets went out to create proxy movements and governments. Usually it was the other way around. There was some kind of local conflict, bottom up, not top down. The dispute was local, not international. One local side called in its Soviet or American ally, and this led the other to call in the other side. The African National Congress got Soviet help and some arms because its enemy, the white government in South Africa, had United States and British backing, at least until the mid-1980s. The Afghanistan Mujahideen took aid from the Saudis, their ideological brothers, and Pakistan, the neighboring sanctuary, but also from the American unbelievers to fight Soviet occupation. Some of those Mujahideen are now once again attacking Kabul, which happens to be backed by the Americans. My favorite case were the Somalis and the Ethiopians. The Soviet Union cultivated the Somali dictatorship, tried to turn it into a mini replica of the Soviet Union. The United States was on the Ethiopian side. The Ethiopians had a revolution. Somalia attacked Ethiopian Ogaden, a Somali inhabited area, in 1977. The Ethiopians fought back. They called in the Soviets. They were now a revolutionary government who sent their military advisors from Mogadishu, routed through Cairo and Moscow, back to Addis Ababa, and ended up on the other side within about 3 weeks, at which point the Somalis called in the Americans. When I visited Somalia in the mid-1980s to give a bunch of lectures on behalf of the US government, I found a very exact replica of a Soviet regime, which was totally on the American side. That was the Cold War. Proxy relationships also evolve. The sponsor gives all sorts of aid, political organization building, military training, along with weapons, to make over the dependent actor in its own image, and often it doesn't work. The Soviet efforts to make communist states out of African allies, proxies, Angola, Ethiopia, failed. The only part of communism that really took root was the dictatorship part. Similarly, the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, and previously in South Vietnam and in other places. So what's different now? Well, one thing I think really is different. Today, we no longer have a superpower that wants to be in the proxy business. The Chinese have a very different strategy of stability and economic expansion, not political or ideological alliance. They seek to create dependencies, but economic dependencies, regardless of politics. The Americans, the other superpower, are retreating from global intervention. There is although not from defense of its own particular interests. That's another matter. There's no domestic constituency in the United States for forever wars or military defense of a nebulous empire. Now, Iran and Turkey and the UAE and the Saudis are in the armed proxy business, and that is where today we get a lot of the connection with what is called terrorism. So is Russia, by the way. All of these states back groups labeled terrorists, and the Middle East is the main arena. Iran has its Hezbollah, its Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen. Each of these relationships is different, although Iran supplies all with weapons and uses all for its interests. Turkey armed its Syrian Islamists to Libya to help the Tripoli government, while on the other side, General Hiftar got weapons and money from the UAE and Egypt and got that contingent of Russian mercenaries, which Ken mentioned, the Wagner Group, who are also active in Syria and now Mozambique and various other places. Labeling a group a proxy is a way usually just to legitimize it. It's like the difference between terrorists and freedom fighters. What's the difference between a proxy and an ally and someone you agree with? Well, good luck. Now, I think the forms of conflict are much in flux at the moment. What will not change is that locals in any conflict will seek military and political help from outside, and will probably find it, including lots of people willing to make a buck selling guns. And I could go on, but let me end there on that one.
Thank you. Wow, I have so many points, and you have created so many questions, but unfortunately we have another 2 questions that I have to ask. But I want to focus on some points that you said, that about the The proxy war being at the end of the day a relationship that focuses on dependence, you said, on ideology, on transaction, and of course on the evolution factor that helps those relationships either grow or be destroyed, if I understood correctly.
Well, this way or that way.
And this leads me to my second question, Professor Singleton. There is a blurred line between sponsoring critical but legitimate political content and investment in misinformation and political polarization is taking place nowadays. What does a media message become? When does a media message become a security concern, according to your opinion?
Well, there are a couple of things to disentangle there. One is the difference between legitimate political content and misinformation. The other is the question of when a message becomes a security concern. These are not quite the same. Again, I'll refer to something from my own experience. The year I taught and lived in Russia watching the Soviet Union come apart with regard to that. The first point is that truth can be more destabilizing, more a security concern than falsehood. And this is particularly the case when outside truth contradicts internal domestic lies in a way obvious to everyone. The BBC and the Voice of America and Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe during the Cold War had a serious destabilizing effect on the Soviet Union. That was their purpose. They existed to destabilize and subvert the Soviets. The weapon used was truthful information. Western radio was a huge security problem for the Soviets. When I lived in Russia that year, I was invited by Soviet colleagues to lecture in what had been Sverdlovsk, a center of Soviet military research, including nuclear and chemical weapons, place where the U-2 was shot down in 1959, and was then being renamed as Yekaterinburg, which it remains today, a flourishing modern city. But all my Russian colleagues and friends, I had many, in Yekaterinburg, confirmed that they all spent time listening to the VOA and the BBC and Radio Liberty, and they would point to the transmission towers up on top of the hill, which were efforts to jam the broadcasts by the Soviets that didn't work. And the whole thing had become, as many things became in the later Soviet Union, something of a joke about the inefficiency and incompetence of the regime. Now, the destabilizing effect depended on the information being true. If it were false, people would find out and reject the source. I think this is still the case. And I'm going to end up arguing here that I have a lot of faith in people's ability to distinguish truth from BS. In the 2016 election, Russian disinformation was in fact quite successful. In the 2020 election, it was much less so because a whole lot of people, publicly and privately, had wised up to the fact of what had been going on. And we now believe, I think, that anything the Russians say must be false, a form of disinformation. But that's probably not true either. Okay, now what about legitimate political content and misinformation? Yes, the line is indeed blurred. It's blurred to the point of being very difficult to untangle. It's like the distinction between terrorists and freedom fighters. Depends on whether you favor the group or the cause. I find it much more useful just to think about propaganda and its techniques. And propaganda is simply any message, true, false, or usually partly true with a spin, that is designed to persuade. The most effective propaganda is selective truth. Selective is the key. For example, it is true that we have a serious problem with racism in America, and you can provide all sorts of evidence for that. Just watch the George Floyd video. See it with your own eyes. This is not disinformation. But if you leave out everything that is done to counter racism, the propaganda against racism, the success of anti-racist protests and rules and political candidates, and the strong and increasing influence of Black celebrities and political leaders, you can leave a very distorted impression. But you have never deviated from showing only that which is true. Selection of facts and evidence, part but not all of the truth, becomes deliberate misinformation. And that's how effective propaganda works. By the way, a historical note here. For many years, the Soviets targeted racism in America in their propaganda to recruit Blacks to the communist cause and to show up the US as hypocritical around the world. And Putin's use of fake racist and anti-racist organizations and trolled messages in 2016 to target and inflame race prejudice continued the old Soviet propaganda tradition. Effective propaganda also plays on the bias of the target, confirmation bias. We all want to learn truth, which reinforces our beliefs. And this is done in images and YouTube videos. Visuals can be just as biased or distorted as print messages. The photograph of the American soldiers raising the flag at Iwo Jima was an extremely effective piece of propaganda. This isn't new either. Also the movies. Go watch Casablanca. It was extremely effective propaganda against the Germans and Nazism. Came right out of Hollywood. And my favorite visual propaganda was the Willie Horton commercial in the presidential campaign of 1988. We were all worried about crime, which was rising. Willie Horton, who was Black, was a convicted murderer in Massachusetts. He was let out on parole, and he then committed rape and robbery. The commercial showed his mugshot and associated his parole and his second crime with presidential candidate Mike Dukakis, who was Massachusetts governor. Black equals criminal equals Democrats equals Dukakis, all in the visual, and it worked. Dukakis lost. Trump tried exactly the same messaging in 2020 with footage of rioting during the Black Lives Matter protests, tried to show falsely that violence was the main content of the anti-racist movement. This time, the political effect wasn't strong enough. It failed. But in both cases, the actual images and information were true. They were selected to create a distorted view confirming race prejudice. One immigrant friend, former student from Somalia, who's now a US citizen and with a very successful career, told me that when he came to America as a teenager, he expected to find violence and crime everywhere in the streets and communities, shootings, car chases, explosions. Sound familiar? This was the image from Hollywood action movies and TV crime shows. Entertainment media can be a very effective form, by the way, of misinformation. They're commercially determined. The purpose is to make money, but they have pretty serious political effects. Finally, let me mention two techniques of real disinformation, deliberate use of falsehood. One is the big lie. The repeated claim that is a wild exaggeration of the truth are completely false, promoted by constant loud repetition, by statements that, in quotes, everyone believes this, end quote, and therefore you should too, since others believe it. It must be true. The mouthpiece for a big lie is usually a charismatic leader, Hitler or Stalin, or Donald Trump. And I don't mean to equate Trump with the totalitarians, but in this regard, there was certainly a similarity. People believe in the leader, and what the leader says must be true. The only way to deny the big lie is to repudiate your belief in the leader or the cause. And that is very, very psychologically painful and difficult. This is why Nikolai Bukharin and his colleagues in the Soviet Politburo, who were targeted by Stalin during the purges, were willing to go on public show trials and sign forced confessions to things they absolutely never had done. They were not willing to repudiate their whole life history as loyal communists. That's one version of the big lie. Hitler's big lie, of course, was the Jewish conspiracy, destroying Christian culture and civilization and taking over the world. Now, there's one other thing that you do to actually disinform, and that's hiding the true source of a message. The message itself can be true or false. This used to be called, I think, black propaganda, something attributed to a source which wasn't the real source. It's really easy on the internet, where you can insert propaganda and then have it amplified by unwitting people who pass it on. But like everything else, this isn't new. During the Cold War, newspaper writers and editors were recruited by the KGB and the CIA and probably everyone else, the British, to print pro-American or anti-Soviet or pro-Soviet or anti-American content, which then was spread around and thus became public knowledge. Finally, difference between sources of information and misinformation. It's not the same thing as the difference between democracies and authoritarian states. The difference is not so much in international transborder dis and misinformation. Everyone plays the international game. The difference is in the domestic use of information war. The authoritarians, most of them, want to propagandize and control their own populations. Democracies have defenses against that in law and in free media trained to be critical of government, and sometimes in the general skepticism of their citizens that the media and people like me encourage. Yes, it's a matter of degree. All governments try to persuade their population to like them, but this difference is really fundamental. And we may go on to talk about China later, but in my view, China, of course, is the primary example of this. China is not authoritarian. It's totalitarian. And the difference is authoritarian regimes will repress overt dissent. If you speak out against their government or try to organize it, you'll get smacked down, like Alexei Navalny, for example, or the critics of Erdogan in Turkey. That's authoritarian. Totalitarian is trying to shape and control what people think from the inside out. All sources of information have to be a part of a state-led effort to shape minds and feelings. And Xi Jinping in China recently used Stalin's key phrase, engineers of the human soul, to describe China's domestic information efforts. China, by the way, does not rely on mis or disinformation in controlling the thought of its citizens. I mean, there are examples of that, but that's not the primary technique. China simply suppresses all information or interpretation that contradicts the party line. And it tries to do this worldwide. It's a strategy of denial of information more than manipulation of it. And then the Chinese add assumptions based on presumed moral righteousness and nationalist indignation. The South China Sea belongs to us. Uyghurs are terrorists, and what we are doing in Xinjiang is bringing them into Chinese society for their own good. Sounds a little bit like civilizing the savages, and it's very similar to it. No Chinese can be a citizen in good standing and believe in a foreign religion, Islam, say, or Catholicism managed by the Pope or a Dalai Lama in India. Hong Kong Democrats are Western stooges mobilized to attack China. And then, of course, the Chinese will unleash patriotic netizens, internet shamers, on anyone who raises any doubts. And this goes well beyond information warfare of a more normal sort. The Chinese campaign is to silence all criticism of China by anyone, anywhere in the world. Say bad things and we'll cut off your business access, or refuse to give you a visa, or go after you online. If you're Chinese by family origin, your family may suffer and you may never see them again. If you are a business importing Chinese products or investing or doing business in China, do not criticize or your business will dry up. Ask the NBA. And note that Tesla electric cars are now manufactured in Shanghai. Zoom, by the way, that's today, has its R&D in Shanghai. And I presume that everything on Zoom, including this, could possibly be accessed by the Chinese Communist Party. If you're a professor, if you criticize China, you will never get a visa to do research or to visit. If I ever apply for a visa, my name may well trigger this interview and lots of other stuffs. Professors and journalists are expected to practice self-censorship because whatever they say will be collected electronically and used if and when the Chinese authorities wish to use it. Chinese have gone to the length of targeting business and media outside China via Chinese influence with other governments. Recently reported that Turkish businessmen, critical of what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, may be denied contracts by the Turkish government after China told Erdogan he must crack down on the Turkish critics of China or else forfeit Chinese help building his Istanbul canal. Maybe that's enough for that. I just maybe add one thing. You can't have a democracy without open access to information, including what a lot of people would consider misinformation. Mm-hmm. Democracy rests on the idea that people will come to understand the difference by testing information against reality and testing arguments against each other. We now understand, this is the 20th century understanding added to the 19th century liberal one, that people are not rational, that they can be fooled and manipulated, and also that many people want an authority which tells them what and how to think. I always give my students Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor essay on that one. Miracle, mystery, and authority is really what people want. Democracies are susceptible to myths and falsehoods and prejudices spread by demagogues claiming free speech to protect their disinformation. QAnon. The only defense is to yell back with better and truer information and to keep on doing so and have some faith that people are smart enough to eventually recognize the difference. Mm-hmm. And the point of democracy is that you are empowered to do that.
Professor Singleton, so at the end of the day, the media message will be distorted, either on the other extreme, it will be 100% manipulated or suppressed, as you already mentioned. So it's, as you said at the end, it's up to the person and the citizen to be informed and educated about distinguishing when there is a propaganda that is trying to manipulate the truth and distort the reality from what's going on in their countries, internally or externally. And you already touched upon the authoritarian part, and thank you for the distinction between authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. And this leads me to my last question for you, Professor Singleton. With the advent of sophisticated information gathering and surveillance technologies, there seems to be a renegotiation between private and public spheres. Do you think innovation is favoring autarkies or democracies? And additionally, are we more afraid of non-state actors or supercharged infrastructures that the state has created? I'm looking forward to your last response, Professor Singleton.
I think innovation favors whichever countries have the most innovative technology, the best research, and the most money. The bet of the Cold War was that that would turn out to be a free model in the West as opposed to a controlled state-led model in the East. And that worked out to be true, but that doesn't mean it's true as a universal law. We will see in the future. Now, let me start with this more afraid of non-state actors or supercharged state infrastructure. That's kind of asking which is worse. Would you prefer a hungry bear or a hungry tiger in your house? I actually don't want either. They also tend to merge. The state wants access to the huge personal data files collected by Facebook and Google and others. And I think eventually efforts to prevent that access will fail, although they may partially succeed in strong countries with democratic laws and privacy laws. In the United States, the National Security Agency and the FBI are expected to not access personal data, but I'm a little skeptical, and we will see. These laws tend to evaporate a bit when national security is brought into the discussion, as indeed they did in the early years of the war on terror. You can read Mike Hayden's memoir, as head of the operation, on that event. Now, that isn't to say that there's no difference. There is no difference. But we're if you step back a little bit, an old pattern. Some people or organizations collect stuff that makes them wealthy. You can probably take this all the way back to, Babylon and ancient China if you want. And then the state muscles in and takes part of it and forces collaboration. The separation of political and commercial authorities and power is very hard to maintain. They merge at the expense of ordinary people and political dissenters. It's hard to prevent. Our current example, obviously, is what Putin did in Russia, with the oligarchs and the Russian economy just muscled the state into control. And in China, the state is in control of every private company, so-called private company in the country. The internet, I think, went through two phases of evolution. First, it went from a bottom-up system of free connections and information exchange to monopolies scarfing up information on users for sale to advertisers, Google and then Facebook. Data is money, and so it's maximized protected by laws enforcing opaque privacy agreements in terms of use, and the use to collect the data is maximized by feeding back to you whatever keeps you glued to the website and the service. Fear and scare and conspiracy and entertainment. Facebook is very, very good at keeping your attention, and so is Google. Affects everybody. In my family, there's concern or has been concern about COVID-19. Nothing unusual about that. So what pops up on the Google feed or on Facebook? Information and links to articles touting the uncontrolled spread of the virus and saying that where we live is high risk or increasing risk. Fear and scare, and you read on. Technology for surveillance, for knowing everything about everybody, is in fact widely available and becoming more so. And I think generally efforts to restrict technology, again, are very, very hard to maintain. Nuclear weapons, the best example. We now have firms all over the place, some of them based in small countries, Estonia, Singapore, Israel, that sell hacking software and facial recognition software, which I believe was first developed in the United States, most widely used in China, and other kinds of intrusive technologies. And this obviously has totalitarian potential. The defenses against it are not in technology itself. The technology will continue to be invented. It will continue to be available if it is allowed to be accessed. And then, again, I'll go back to the extreme example of use, which is what China is doing in Xinjiang. The Chinese collect data on every member of the Uyghur population, which is facial recognition, location. All cell phones and cars have location monitors in them, tracking who is called and where they are, what the contacts are. Encryption enables you to shield the content itself, but it doesn't enable you to shield who you called and when. And various other things, DNA samples, millions of surveillance cameras. And so the result is you end up with the relative, in quotes, of a Uyghur family, a Han Chinese sent in to monitor their behavior, who informs that family. And I have this in a translated Chinese document that I dug up and was sent one of my China feeds. We know where you've been. We know who have talked to here and abroad. And if you have used any closed or encrypted communication, why? You must have something to hide. If you confess its content, you'll be re-educated. If you refuse, you're presumed to be a terrorist and will be imprisoned, and then perhaps sent to forced labor. If you go to mosque or have any Islamic symbols in your home, you are presumed loyal to a foreign religion and will be re-educated in one of our camps. Children are forcibly sent to boarding schools to learn in Mandarin and to be assimilated to Han culture. It's exactly the same as the old practice in the United States and Canada and Australia of sending Native American kids to boarding schools to civilize them. We now consider this an awful thing and a form of cultural genocide. Well, in Xinjiang, they're trying to do it to millions of kids. It's a campaign of forced assimilation, cultural genocide, if you will. And the point is, it's not just directed, well, it is at the moment directed against a Uyghur minority, but there is absolutely nothing in the technology that prevents it from being used in much the same way to control a much broader population. The technology is available and it's being tested. In China, control, loyalty, conformity, and homogeneity are now touted as part of China's cultural heritage. The nice words for it are harmony and stability. Now, could this happen elsewhere in other countries? Well, the restraints are moral and political, not technological. Certainly the United States and Europe and a lot of other places, Asia, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, could have a very high level of surveillance if law and politics permitted. The UK is interesting. There are a few legal restraints, but strong moral and political ones. So go back to the bear and the tiger in the house. Commercial use of my data and manipulation of me via Facebook or Google or others is a pain in the neck, and in the United States at present can't be prevented. But state collection and potential use of data is far worse. There's some other nefarious possibilities as well. States, their intelligence services could sell data about individuals, target them. Now, for $1,000, I can get you the complete electronic file on Karina Iskandarova. And Karina, if you don't want your complete data sent to, fill in the blank, I have a small job you could do for me to prevent that. And this is very easy. One final point. New communications technologies are destabilizing. That's a long-term historical observation. They have serious consequences in fostering upheaval, instability of various sorts. Example, printing press in the 16th century enabled spread of the vernacular, literacy, print of the Bible that everybody could read, which destabilized the Catholic Church and was related to the horrible wars of religion over more than a century. Another example, radio and cinema in the early 20th century enabled demagogues and dictators to reach the masses directly. This didn't start with Twitter, with their fascist and communist messages. It eliminated the intermediary. It's like Twitter and Facebook. You could listen to Hitler on the radio or see him at the movies. And of course, good guys used these technologies as well. Think of Roosevelt's fireside chats on the radio and Churchill's use of the radio during the Second World War. Novelty wears off. New media technologies become tamed and civilized and normal. And I think we're seeing this now with internet media. And you have to simply let that happen and try to control the upheaval as it does. In my view, official state censorship of what is labeled by whom? disinformation or misinformation is a bad idea. The cure over the long term, the cure is worse than the disease. And I think the question now is whether democracies will have patience as the disinformation and misinformation spread on the internet flourishes before it fades.
Wow, that was very, very interesting. And I am shocked and terrified, to be honest, because I don't want the hungry bear nor the hungry tiger in my house. And I definitely don't want this intrusive surveillance from either non-state actors or from my country. So I totally agree with you, and all these points that you brought and the historical examples. Humans always had the ability to use their own means back then to either promote propaganda or to silence rumors regarding how they are ruling their countries. But now we see humans have managed to also use the internet on their advantage, and that is really scary. And I hope legislation is going to be put in place so that we have the right and the power to control what is going outside of our computers and to whom. And when you said, Karina Iskandarova, if I pay $1,000 and have access to your data, this is scary because they can also predict what I vote for, what kind of a financial status I have, where I'm living. They can get so much information, and they can manipulate also elections through this thing. So this is really scary at the end of the day. And I want to thank you both, Professor Hillas and Professor Singleton, for this intriguing discussion and historical examples that you brought, and from your own personal experience, Professor Hillas, in the US Department of State. And of course, Professor Singleton, all this experience and all these historical examples provided a lot of information in the most simple manner for all those who might not have the same knowledge. Both of your views and expertise are highly appreciated. Once again, thank you for being here, and see you at the panel interview.
Thank you, Karina.